February 18, 1944. The Yukon wilderness stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of gunmetal, where temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero and the wind carved razor-sharp patterns across frozen tundra. Second Lieutenant Leon Crane, 24 years old, Philadelphia-born, felt his B-24 Liberator shudder violently as ice accumulated on the wings at an altitude of 9,000 feet. The four-engine bomber had departed from Ladd Field near Fairbanks 3 hours earlier on what should have been a routine navigation training flight. A milk run, the crews called it, nothing more than practice for pilots destined for combat theaters where flak and fighters awaited. But Alaska had its own brutality. Indifferent to the uniforms men wore or the flags they served. Through the cockpit window, Crane watched the propellers labor against air so cold it seemed to crystallize around the aircraft. The engine temperature gauges fluctuated wildly. Then the number 3 engine coughed, sputtered, and died. In the military lexicon of 1944, this was classified as a mechanical failure during adverse weather conditions. In human terms, it was the beginning of a test that would strip away every assumption about survival, endurance, and the thin membrane separating life from oblivion. The Alaskan theater in 1944 occupied a peculiar position in American strategic thinking, simultaneously vital and forgotten. After the Japanese seizure of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands in June 1942, the only American territory occupied during the war, the military had poured resources into defending this northwestern frontier. 11,000 American soldiers had died retaking those barren islands, fighting in conditions so severe that frostbite casualties exceeded combat wounds. By February 1944, with the Japanese expelled, Alaska had become a training ground where bomber crews learned navigation across featureless terrain, where compasses spun uselessly near the magnetic North Pole, where weather systems materialized with homicidal speed. The 11th Air Force operated dozens of B-24 Liberators from bases scattered across the territory, massive four-engine bombers designed for high-altitude precision bombing over Europe and the Pacific. These aircraft, with their distinctive twin-tail fins and deep fuselage, required crews of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer, and 4 gunners. They were complex machines, temperamental in extreme cold, prone to icing that could add tons of weight to wings and control surfaces within minutes. Leon Crane had received his commission and wings 6 months earlier. He possessed no wilderness training. No survival course had prepared him for subarctic conditions. The Army Air Forces assumed that bomber crews would either complete their missions or die in the attempt. There was little middle ground in the calculus of aerial warfare. Crane knew how to fly, how to drop bombs on target, how to navigate by stars and dead reckoning. He could recite the technical specifications of the B-24, identify every gauge and control by touch and darkness. But he had never built a fire without matches, never snared an animal, never spent a night outdoors in winter. He was a product of American urban life, a city boy from Philadelphia, where central heating and corner groceries insulated citizens from nature's indifference. The military had transformed him into a pilot, but had not imagined he would need to become something more primitive, more fundamental, a survivor in the oldest sense of the word. The B-24 carried a crew of 5 that morning, reduced from the standard complement for a training flight. Besides Crane, there was co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant Clarence Anderson, navigator 2nd Lieutenant Harold Hoskin, radio operator Corporal Clyde Barnett, and Sergeant Richard Pompeo, the flight engineer. They had climbed into the aircraft before dawn, completing the pre-flight checklist while their breath formed clouds in the sub-zero air. The Liberator's aluminum skin was so cold it burned bare skin on contact. Ground crews had preheated the engines using portable heaters, a laborious process necessary to prevent oil from congealing into useless sludge. By 800 hours, they were airborne, climbing through broken clouds toward their assigned training route, a rectangular pattern that would take them northeast over mountains and frozen rivers before returning to Ladd Field. None of them knew they would never see that airfield again. When the number 3 engine failed, Crane fought to maintain altitude, but the remaining 3 engines could not compensate for the weight of ice accumulating on the wings and fuselage. The altimeter unwound steadily, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. Below, the landscape offered no comfort, only an endless procession of snow-covered peaks and valleys. Anderson worked the controls alongside Crane, while Hoskin frantically calculated their position. The radio crackled with static. Atmospheric conditions in the Arctic often made communication impossible, and they were beyond range of ground stations. Pompeo moved through the fuselage checking system, searching for solutions that did not exist. At 5,000 feet, a second engine began to fail. The mathematics of flight became inexorable. A B-24 Liberator weighed 32,000 pounds empty, 65,000 pounds fully loaded. With 2 engines gone and ice adding unknown tonnage, they were no longer an aircraft but a falling object with pretensions of control. Crane gave the order to prepare for crash landing. There was no time for elaborate planning, no opportunity to select an ideal site. The wilderness below was uniformly hostile, jagged mountains, frozen lakes, forests of black spruce so dense they seemed to absorb light. He aimed for what appeared to be a valley, a slightly less vertical slope between peaks, hoping the deep snow might cushion impact. The co-pilot called out altitude, 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. The ground rushed upward with terrible finality. Crane pulled back on the yoke, trying to bleed off speed to convert momentum into something survivable. The B-24 struck the mountainside at approximately 1100 hours, the fuselage tearing open like fabric, metal shrieking against rock and ice. The world became a chaos of noise and motion, of objects transforming into projectiles, of the fundamental structure of reality disintegrating. Then silence, profound and absolute, broken only by the hiss of snow against hot metal and the wind's eternal commentary. Leon Crane regained consciousness in darkness. Blood obscured his vision. His right leg throbbed with a pain so intense it seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of his body. The cockpit had collapsed around him, but he was alive, capable of thought, capable of movement. He called out for the others. Anderson's voice answered weakly from somewhere in the wreckage, then nothing. No response from Hoskin, Barnett, or Pompeo. Crane pulled himself free of the crushed cockpit, emerging into afternoon light filtered through low clouds. The B-24 had broken into 3 sections, scattered across 100 yards of mountainside. The tail section lay upside down 50 yards distant. One wing had sheared completely off, embedded in a snowbank. The temperature was approximately 20 below zero, and Crane wore only his flight suit, leather jacket, pants, boots, gloves designed for heated cockpits, not wilderness survival. He found Anderson barely alive, crushed beneath debris, beyond any help Crane could provide. The co-pilot died while Crane held his hand, a process that took 20 minutes and taught the pilot that death was not always instantaneous, not always merciful. The other 3 crewmen were dead, their bodies broken by impact forces that human flesh could not withstand. Crane was alone on a mountainside in interior Alaska in February with temperatures that could kill an exposed man in hours. He had no training for this circumstance, no manual to consult, no authority to provide instructions. The military hierarchy that had structured his life since enlistment had vanished, replaced by the older hierarchy of thermodynamics and biology, where body temperature and caloric intake determined survival more absolutely than any general's orders. In the wreckage, Crane found 2 parachutes, a sleeping bag, an emergency ration kit containing chocolate bars and malted milk tablets, a knife, matches, and a compass. These items constituted his inheritance, the sum total of resources between him and death. He also found something unexpected, a copy of Robinson Crusoe, someone's personal reading material, now transformed into an accidentally prophetic text. Night fell with Arctic swiftness, the sun disappearing by 1700 hours to be replaced by darkness that would last 15 hours. Crane crawled into the fuselage, wrapping himself in the parachutes and sleeping bag, his injured leg sending pulses of agony through his nervous system. The temperature inside the wreckage dropped to match the outside air. Metal provides no insulation, and the B-24's aluminum skin conducted cold with perfect efficiency. He ate 2 chocolate bars, the sugar providing brief warmth as his metabolism converted calories into heat. The physiological mathematics were simple but unforgiving. The human body at rest burns approximately 70 calories per hour. In extreme cold, that rate doubles or triples as involuntary shivering attempts to maintain core temperature. Crane's emergency rations contained perhaps 3,000 calories total, less than 2 days' worth at Arctic metabolic rates. After that, his body would begin consuming itself, converting muscle and fat into fuel, a process that could continue for weeks but ended invariably in the same destination. He had expected death to feel different, more dramatic, more sudden. Instead, it set itself through incremental degradation, through the slow cooling of extremities, through the drowsiness that precedes hypothermia's final sleep. But Leon Crane did not possess the temperament for passive acceptance. Philadelphia had taught him resourcefulness, the Depression-era understanding that survival required improvisation and stubbornness in equal measure. The Army Air Forces had taught him systematic problem-solving, the pilot's methodology of identifying issues and implementing solutions under pressure. He possessed no wilderness skills, but he possessed something potentially more valuable: the conviction that problems had solutions, that circumstances could be altered through action rather than accepted through resignation. As dawn returned on February 19, Crane made a decision that would define the next 11 weeks. He would walk out. He would find civilization or die trying, but he would not simply wait for death in the wreckage. The crashed B-24 lay approximately 80 miles southwest of the village of Big Delta, though Crane did not know this. He did not know that the nearest human settlement in any direction required traversing mountain ranges, crossing frozen rivers, navigating through forests where black spruce grew so thick that progress measured in yards per hour. He did not know that search aircraft would fail to locate his wreckage, that the vastness of Alaska's interior could swallow a 4-engine bomber without trace. His compass indicated north, and north held the theoretical possibility of roads, railroads, settlements, the infrastructure of civilization that must exist somewhere in this wilderness. He fashioned crude snowshoes from the parachutes, binding fabric to improvised wooden frames using wire salvaged from the aircraft. He carried the sleeping bag, the remaining rations, matches wrapped carefully in waterproof material, the knife, and Robinson Crusoe. The book had become talismanic, its protagonist's survival on a tropical island, offering no practical guidance for Arctic conditions but providing psychological companionship, the knowledge that solitude could be endured, that one man alone might persist. The first week tested every assumption Crane held about human capability. Walking through deep snow, even with makeshift snowshoes, required enormous energy expenditure. He covered perhaps 3 miles per day, exhausting himself completely, collapsing each evening into sleep so profound it resembled unconsciousness. The mountains channeled him into valleys that twisted unpredictably, leading him in directions his compass suggested were wrong but which terrain made unavoidable. He discovered that Alaska's winter landscape possessed a uniformity that defeated navigation. Every valley looked identical, every ridgeline interchangeable, every stand of spruce forest a replica of the last. Time began to lose meaning. Days blurred together, measured only by the cycle of light and darkness, by the slow depletion of his rations, by the increasing prominence of his hip bones and ribs as his body consumed itself. He had expected to find signs of human presence: a trapper's cabin, a mining camp, a road. The American mind in 1944 still held assumptions about the nation's geography, a belief that wilderness existed only in pockets, that civilization's web had penetrated even remote regions. But interior Alaska mocked such assumptions. This was emptiness on a continental scale, territory where indigenous peoples had lived for millennia in careful adaptation to conditions that killed unprepared outsiders with casual efficiency. Crane saw no cabins, no trails, no indication that humans had ever touched this landscape. He saw only the endless procession of snow and trees and mountains, the sky's changing moods, the northern lights that sometimes danced overhead in green curtains, beautiful and utterly indifferent to his survival. The emergency rations lasted 9 days. On February 27, Crane consumed the final malted milk tablet, and his situation transformed from desperate to seemingly hopeless. He now faced starvation in its most literal form, the absence of any food source in an environment that appeared utterly sterile. But Alaska's winter wilderness was not truly barren. It merely hoarded its resources, presenting them in forms Crane had never imagined as food. On the 10th day, delirious with hunger, he noticed a spruce grouse perched on a low branch, its plumage mottled brown and white, its dark eyes watching him with avian indifference. The bird seemed almost tame, unaccustomed to humans, unwary. Crane approached slowly, extended his hand, and grabbed the grouse before it could react. The bird's neck broke with a small snap, and Crane possessed his first meal in 24 hours. He had never killed an animal before, never prepared wild game, never eaten anything he had not purchased from a store or been served in a mess hall. The grouse weighed perhaps a pound, covered in feathers that had to be removed, containing organs that had to be extracted. With shaking hands, cold-numbed fingers barely functional, Crane plucked and gutted the bird using his knife. He built a fire using spruce boughs and precious matches, cooked the meat imperfectly, and ate everything edible: flesh, heart, liver, even the softened bones. The calories were insufficient for a man burning 4,000 per day, but they were not zero. The grouse postponed death by perhaps 48 hours, and 48 hours might contain another grouse, another small victory against the mathematics of starvation. This became Crane's pattern: walking north through the wilderness, setting crude snares using parachute cord, sometimes catching spruce grouse or snowshoe hare, often catching nothing. The indigenous peoples of Alaska possessed sophisticated trapping knowledge accumulated across generations, understanding animal behavior, seasonal patterns, optimal snare placement. Crane possessed only trial and error, suffering the errors and hunger that left him hollow and weak, grateful beyond measure for the rare trials that succeeded. He learned to recognize animal tracks in snow, the paired prints of snowshoe hare, the delicate marks of ptarmigan, the larger trails of moose and caribou he could not hope to kill with only a knife. He learned that spruce grouse often perched low and allowed close approach, that they constituted his most reliable food source. He learned to eat everything, to crack bones and suck the marrow, to chew hide and sinew, to recognize that squeamishness was a luxury belonging to a former life in a heated Philadelphia apartment. A March Crane had traveled perhaps 40 miles from the crash site, though his meandering route meant he had covered twice that distance on foot. His flight suit hung loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds. His face had become gaunt, the skin stretched tight over bones, his eyes sunk deep in their sockets. He no longer thought in complex sentences or contemplated abstract concepts. His consciousness had narrowed to immediate concerns: find food, make fire, keep moving, survive until tomorrow. The injury to his leg had become infected, the wound suppurating despite his attempts at cleanliness, the tissue around it inflamed and hot to touch. He knew infection could kill as surely as starvation or exposure, but he possessed no antibiotics, no medical supplies beyond crude bandages torn from his clothing. He walked on the damaged leg because stopping meant death, and so the body adapted, distributing weight differently, compensating through 1,000 small adjustments governed by the brain's primitive survival centers. He had expected rescue. During the first weeks, he had scanned the sky constantly, hoping to see search aircraft, believing the military would mount extensive efforts to locate missing crews. But no aircraft appeared. The vastness of Alaska's interior defeated aerial search even in clear weather, and winter storms frequently grounded all flights for days. The 11th Air Force had limited resources, spread across thousands of square miles of territory. Crews went missing regularly, lost in weather, crashed in mountains, swallowed by wilderness. Each received search efforts proportional to available assets and probable locations, but those probabilities favored certain regions, certain flight paths. Crane's B-24 had crashed far from its intended route, driven off course by the engine failures and subsequent emergency. It had come to rest in terrain that search patterns did not cover, that maps designated with the blank spaces reserved for unexplored or irrelevant territory. As March progressed, as official search efforts were suspended, Crane became not a missing pilot but a casualty, a name transferred from active duty rosters to memorial lists, a family in Philadelphia receiving the telegram that began, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." But the man himself continued walking north. By mid-March, the days had lengthened perceptibly. The sun rose earlier, set later, the increased light both blessing and curse. Longer days meant more time to travel, but they also revealed the enormity of the landscape, the impossible distances still separating Crane from salvation. He had developed a crude competence in wilderness survival, could start fires in snow, construct minimal shelters using spruce boughs, catch the occasional grouse or hare. These skills kept him alive but did not constitute thriving. His body was consuming itself at a rate that protein from small game could not replace. Medical literature would later document that the human body can survive approximately 60 days without food, depending on initial body mass and environment. TAL conditions. Crane was beyond 30 days, entering the territory where physiological collapse becomes probable, where the heart muscle itself begins to be metabolized for energy, where cognitive function degrades unpredictably. He began to hallucinate, not dramatic visions but small perceptual distortions, shadows that resembled buildings, sounds that seemed like voices, the conviction that just beyond the next ridge lay a road, a town, people who could help. These hallucinations were not madness but the brain's deterioration under extreme stress, neurons firing erratically as glucose levels fluctuated, as dehydration concentrated electrolytes, as sleep deprivation accumulated into a debt that could never be fully repaid. Crane learned to distrust his perceptions, to verify visually anything his mind reported, to accept that his own cognition had become unreliable. This meta-awareness, the consciousness observing its own dysfunction, may have been what saved him from decisions that would have proven fatal. Hallucinating men wandered in circles, convinced they were traveling toward salvation. Crane doubted his senses enough to trust the compass, to maintain northward progress even when his mind insisted otherwise. On March 28, 40 days after the crash, Crane encountered the first unmistakable sign of human activity. A line cut through the forest, perhaps 20 feet wide, running east-west as far as he could see in both directions. Trees had been cleared, stumps protruding through the snow, the straightness of the clearing proclaiming human intention and engineering. For several minutes, Crane simply stood and stared, unable to trust that this might be real, not another hallucination. Then he knelt and touched one of the stumps, feeling the axe marks in the wood, the geometric precision of human cutting. This was real. This was a survey line or a power line cut or a road in early stages of construction. It was proof that people existed, that civilization extended even into this wilderness, that his northward march had not been in vain. He turned east along the cleared line, reasoning that it must lead somewhere, that whoever had cleared this path would have begun from a settlement or camp. The walking became easier on the relatively flat cut, and Crane covered perhaps 8 miles that day, more distance than he had managed in any previous 24 hours. As darkness fell, he built a fire and allowed himself a luxury he had denied for weeks: hope. Not the abstract hope of eventual rescue, but concrete, specific hope that tomorrow or the day after might bring him to people, to food, to safety. That night he dreamed of Philadelphia, of his mother's kitchen, of the corner diner where he had eaten breakfast before enlisting, of bacon and eggs and toast and coffee. The ordinary abundance of American civilian life that he had never appreciated until it became impossible fantasy. The cleared line led him to a tributary of the Tanana River, the water still frozen but the ice beginning to show signs of spring's approach. Small pools of meltwater on the surface, areas where the ice had darkened and thinned. Following the river downstream, Crane walked for 3 more days, sustained now not by food, he had caught nothing since finding the cut line, but by the conviction that this river must flow toward human settlement, that rivers were highways in wilderness, that people built along waterways. His body had entered the final stages of starvation, the point where muscle mass had been so depleted that basic functions began to fail. His heartbeat had become irregular. He urinated infrequently, and when he did, the color was dark amber, indicating severe dehydration despite snow he melted for drinking water. His thought processes had slowed, each decision requiring enormous mental effort, the simplest tasks demanding concentration he could barely muster. On April 8, 50 days after the crash, Leon Crane saw smoke rising above the trees ahead. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people. He had dreamed of this moment, hallucinated it, imagined it so many times that he initially dismissed it as another perceptual error. But the smoke persisted, solid and real, a gray column rising into the pale blue sky. He walked toward it, his pace unconsciously quickening despite exhaustion so profound it seemed cellular. The trees thinned, opening onto a small clearing where a cabin stood, rough-hewn logs chinked with moss, smoke rising from a metal chimney. Outside the cabin, 2 men worked, sawing firewood, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. They were speaking English. They were Americans. They were real. Crane walked into the clearing, and one of the men looked up, saw him, and simply stared. Crane understood what he must look like: skeletal, filthy, dressed in rags that had once been a flight suit, more apparition than man. He tried to speak, to identify himself, but his voice emerged as a croak, the vocal cords atrophied from weeks of disuse. The men approached cautiously, and one of them finally said, "My God, are you from that B-24 that went missing?" Crane nodded. The man continued, "When did you crash?" Crane thought about this, realized he did not know the current date, had lost count of days, could only respond, February 18th, 19th, somewhere around then. The calculation was made for him. It was April 8, 1944. He had survived 50 days in the Alaskan wilderness. The cabin belonged to trappers Albert and Jack, men who spent winters in the bush and returned to Fairbanks with pelts each spring. They had a radio and called for emergency assistance. They fed Crane carefully, understanding that a starving man could not tolerate rich food, that refeeding syndrome could prove fatal even after survival. They gave him broth, small amounts of bread, weak tea. The body that had learned to function on 300 calories per day could not immediately process the abundance it craved. The military sent a rescue team that arrived the following day, and Leon Crane was evacuated to the hospital at Ladd Field. He weighed 106 pounds, having lost 64 pounds from his pre-crash weight. His leg infection had spread, requiring surgical debridement and antibiotics. Doctors marveled that he was alive, that he had retained enough cognitive function to navigate, that his heart had not simply failed under the compound stresses of starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. The military conducted an investigation, standard procedure for any aircraft loss. They recovered the wreckage and the bodies of the 4 other crewmen, bringing them home for burial. They interviewed Crane extensively, documenting his survival in clinical language, dates, distances, methods, observations. The official report noted that Second Lieutenant Leon Crane had demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness and determination under extreme survival conditions, but the dry bureaucratic prose could not capture the transformation that had occurred on that mountainside and in the weeks that followed. Crane had departed Ladd Field as a product of industrial modernity, a technician trained to operate complex machinery in pursuit of strategic military objectives. He returned as something older, having reconnected with capacities the species possessed before civilization insulated humans from direct confrontation with nature's indifference. What had he expected? He had expected to fly training missions and then deploy to a combat theater, perhaps Europe where B-24s hammered German industrial targets, perhaps the Pacific where they supported island-hopping campaigns. He had expected to fight other men, to drop bombs on strategic targets, to participate in the vast mechanized conflict that consumed millions of lives between 1939 and 1945. He had expected war in its modern form, technological, impersonal, conducted with radio communications and precision instruments. He had not expected to become Robinson Crusoe, to discover that survival required skills no training manual covered, that the most fundamental human struggle remained unchanged across millennia. The individual organism confronting an environment that recognized no special pleading, that granted no exceptions, that operated according to laws older and more absolute than any human institution. What had he actually experienced? He had learned that the human body possesses reserves beyond conscious knowledge, that consciousness itself can contract or expand depending on circumstances, that personality and individual identity become luxuries when base survival occupies every calorie and every thought. He had learned that food was not a right but a perpetual challenge, that each meal represented a small victory against entropy and death. He had learned that technology's failure did not mean human failure, that the same problem-solving capability that created aircraft could be redirected toward constructing snares and building fires, that adaptability rather than specialization determined survival when circumstances changed catastrophically. He had learned that solitude was bearable but not pleasant, that the human animal was social by nature, that the absence of other voices created a silence more profound than mere lack of sound. The symbolic object that recurred throughout his ordeal, that represented both his former life and his desperate present, was the knife. He had carried it from the wreckage, a standard military-issue blade, steel and bone handle, designed for utility rather than combat. With it, he had gutted grouse and hare, cut spruce boughs for shelter, carved improvised tools, performed the 1,000 small tasks that survival required. The knife connected him to human history's deeper currents, to the Paleolithic hunters who had survived ice ages with similar implements, to the fundamental tool that separated humans from other species, not the most sophisticated tool, not the most powerful, but the most versatile, the one that enabled other tools' creation. In Alaska's wilderness, the knife had proven more valuable than the sophisticated instruments that filled the B-24's cockpit. Airspeed indicators and altimeters became useless metal once the aircraft crashed. The knife remained essential, a reminder that certain technologies transcend historical periods, that some tools embody permanent rather than temporary solutions to survival's recurring problems. The epilogue to Leon Crane's survival must acknowledge what he himself understood, that his ordeal represented not heroism but accident, not mastery but luck, not exceptional ability but merely sufficient stubbornness combined with marginally adequate skill and barely sufficient fortune. Dozens of other men crashed in Alaska's wilderness during the war. Most died within hours or days. A few survived for weeks before perishing. Crane survived not because he possessed superior qualities, but because small factors aligned in his favor. The grouse he caught when starvation loomed, the cleared line he encountered at the limit of his endurance, the trapper's cabin positioned barely within the distance his failing body could cover. Remove any single element, and his story would have ended with bones discovered years later by hikers or hunters, evidence of another casualty absorbed into the wilderness that surrounded military operations in America's northern frontier. But he did survive, and his survival illuminates a truth larger than individual circumstance. The United States in 1944 fought a war characterized by industrial abundance, by the capacity to produce thousands of aircraft and millions of tons of supplies, by technological sophistication that overwhelmed enemies through sheer material superiority. American soldiers expected to be supported by this machinery, to operate as components in a vast system that provided regular meals, medical care, ammunition, reinforcements, air support, and logistical infrastructure. The system worked astonishingly well, enabling military operations across global distances, sustaining millions of men in combat theaters from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. But systems could fail, and when they failed, individuals confronted older realities. Leon Crane's B-24 represented American industrial might, 4 engines producing 4,800 horsepower, capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs across 2,000 miles. When that machine crashed, when technology failed, Crane discovered that survival required different capacities: improvisation, adaptation, the willingness to do degrading and difficult things without the comfort of institutional support. His survival validated not American exceptionalism but human universality, the species' capacity to endure when circumstances stripped away modern comforts. Indigenous peoples in Alaska had survived for millennia using knowledge Crane lacked but possessed the capacity to partially recreate. His 11 weeks in the wilderness constituted an abbreviated education in lessons others had learned across lifetimes. The contrast between what soldiers expected and what they experienced characterized the entire war effort, not just in Alaska but in every theater. Young men trained on American bases with reliable food, shelter, equipment, and mail from home. They deployed to combat zones where the certainties evaporated, where supplies might not arrive, where equipment failed, where letters took weeks or months, where the individual became profoundly isolated despite being surrounded by thousands of other soldiers. They expected war to be terrible but comprehensible, a series of dangerous missions followed by periods of rest, all supported by the overwhelming resources of American production. They experienced war as chaos interrupted by occasional order, as extended boredom punctuated by moments of terror, as a condition where training provided frameworks that reality continually violated. But perhaps no contrast exceeded what Leon Crane experienced, from heated cockpit to frozen mountainside, from member of a 5-man crew to solitary survivor, from technician operating sophisticated machinery to primitive hunter tracking grouse through snow. That transformation, compressed into 50 days, revealed the thinness of civilization's veneer, the speed with which modern humans could revert to older modes when necessity demanded. It also revealed that reversion was possible, that the knowledge was not lost but merely dormant, that crisis could awaken capacities that comfort allowed to atrophy. In the spring of 1944, as Leon Crane recovered in the hospital at Ladfield, the war continued its grinding progress. In Europe, Allied forces prepared for D-Day, the cross-channel invasion that would begin the liberation of France. In the Pacific, American forces advanced island by island toward Japan, each landing contested by defenders who fought with suicidal intensity. Millions of men participated in this global conflict, each contributing to outcomes that would reshape the post-war world. Most would survive and return home to resume civilian lives, carrying memories of combat or boredom or foreign places. Few would carry memories comparable to Crane's: the existential loneliness of the wilderness, the daily confrontation with death through starvation or exposure, the knowledge that survival depended entirely on individual resourcefulness without hope of rescue or relief. The freedom for which the war was ostensibly fought, freedom from fascist tyranny, freedom of democratic self-determination, freedom of individual conscience and expression, found peculiar expression in the Alaskan wilderness. There Leon Crane experienced absolute freedom in the most literal sense, freedom from authority, from institutional structure, from any human constraint. He could do anything or nothing, walk in any direction or remain stationary, expend energy or conserve it. Every decision was his alone, every consequence his to bear. This freedom proved nearly fatal. It demonstrated that freedom without resources, without knowledge, without support systems, becomes indistinguishable from abandonment. True freedom required not just absence of constraint, but presence of capability, the skills, tools, and knowledge to convert possibility into actuality. American abundance, the industrial capacity that allowed the nation to supply forces across multiple theaters while maintaining civilian prosperity, seemed impossibly distant from the perspective of a starving man crawling through snowdrifts. But that abundance was what made survival possible. The knife came from American steel mills. The parachute fabric came from American textile factories. The matches came from American chemical production. Even Robinson Crusoe was an American edition, printed on American presses, distributed through American commercial networks. The crashed B-24 itself, though useless as transportation, provided materials, wire, fabric, metal, that enabled improvised solutions. Abundance allowed redundancy, provided the surplus from which survivors could scavenge resources. Scarcity would have meant nothing to salvage, no materials to repurpose, no margin for error. The transformation in Leon Crane's perception of American life, of the ordinary comforts he had never questioned before February 1944, proved permanent. He would later describe the experience of walking into a grocery store after his recovery, standing in the produce section and weeping at the sight of food casually displayed, available to anyone with pocket change, treated as so common it required no special acknowledgement. Men who had never been hungry could not understand what food meant to those who had starved. They saw commodities, prices, choices between brands. Crane saw miracles, each can of vegetables or package of meat representing labor and infrastructure so complex it seemed incomprehensible that such abundance could be sustained. The Depression had taught his parents' generation to value thrift and avoid waste. Alaska taught him something deeper, that waste was a privilege only abundance permitted, that the casual discarding of edible food represented wealth beyond calculation. His survival also transformed military survival training, the Army Air F. Orcs began developing formal programs to prepare air crews for wilderness survival, teaching skills that had been considered unnecessary for pilots who supposedly would either complete missions or die in crashes. Crane's 50 days demonstrated that crashes could be survived, that men could persist long enough to reach safety if they possessed basic knowledge. Survival schools were established, teaching fire starting, shelter construction, water procurement, food foraging. These programs drew on knowledge from indigenous peoples, from trappers and hunters, from anyone who possessed practical wilderness skills. The military had assumed technology made such knowledge obsolete. Alaska proved that assumption false. Technology could fail, and when it failed, older knowledge remained relevant, remained literally life-saving. There is no singular meaning to extract from Leon Crane's survival, no simple lesson that encapsulates 11 weeks of hunger and cold and solitude. But perhaps this much can be said. The war tested nations and technologies, strategies and ideologies, but it ultimately tested individuals. It asked questions older than modern civilization. Can you endure? Can you adapt? Can you continue when every reason suggests surrender? Crane's answer was yes, delivered not through words but through action, through the daily decision to keep walking north, to keep searching for food, to keep maintaining the small fire that separated life from freezing death. That answer did not require training or technology or institutional support, though all helped when available. It required only the fundamental human capacity to persist, to problem solve, to refuse the logic of hopelessness even when hope seemed irrational. The mountains of interior Alaska remain largely unchanged from February 1944. The wilderness persists, indifferent to the brief drama of human survival that occasionally unfolds within its boundaries. Snow still falls in winter, temperatures still plunge to 40 below zero, grouse still perch on low branches, and the northern lights still dance across dark skies. The B-24 Liberator, that emblem of American industrial might, has long since been salvaged or dissolved into rust, its metal returning to the earth from which ore was originally extracted. But the story persists, transmitted through official reports and personal testimony, through the historical record that preserves not just victories and defeats but also individual struggles, the small dramas that reveal larger truths about human nature when stripped of cultural overlay. On April 8, 1944, when trappers radioed that they had found a survivor from the missing B-24, officers at Ladd Field initially doubted the report. No one survived 50 days in winter wilderness without training, without adequate supplies, without support. The mathematics did not allow it. But mathematics occasionally failed to account for variables that could not be quantified: stubbornness, luck, the irrational human refusal to accept death when acceptance would be easier than resistance. Leon Crane had survived not by defying the laws of nature, but by learning them quickly enough and thoroughly enough to find the narrow path between too little knowledge and too late. He had discovered what indigenous peoples knew, what pioneers had learned, what modern technology had allowed most Americans to forget: that survival was not guaranteed, not a right, not something institutions could ensure in every circumstance. It was earned daily through competence and luck in proportions that varied unpredictably. The poetic reflection must acknowledge that freedom and abundance, the American ideals for which the war was fought, reveal their full meaning only in contrast to their absence. Leon Crane experienced the absolute freedom of total isolation and found it nearly fatal. He experienced the absolute scarcity of starvation and found it clarified what mattered beyond any peacetime philosophy. When rescued, when returned to the institutional embrace of the military, when eventually discharged to resume civilian life, he carried knowledge that no classroom could provide, that comfort was precious, that food was never merely food, that the presence of other humans was not an inconvenience but a fundamental requirement, that technology served humans but could not replace human capability, that modern life rested on foundations easily shattered, revealing the older struggles beneath. The war would end in August 1945 with Japanese surrender following atomic bombardment, bringing closure to a conflict that had killed millions and reshaped global politics. Victory parades would celebrate returning soldiers, ticker tape falling like snow on urban streets, crowds celebrating the triumph of democracy over fascism, of freedom over tyranny, of American abundance over scarcity and want. Leon Crane would participate in that celebration, grateful to be alive, to have survived not just the wilderness, but the entire war. But part of him would remain in Alaska, in the mountains where he learned lessons no victory parade could teach, where he discovered that survival required no ideology or patriotism, only the daily decision to continue when continuation seemed impossible, to adapt when adaptation meant abandoning every assumption about how life should be lived. In the end, perhaps that is the larger truth his survival illuminates, that ideologies and technologies rise and fall, that empires and nations succeed and fail, that even the most terrible wars eventually end, but the fundamental human struggle persists across all historical periods and political systems. Each generation must learn again that survival is not guaranteed, that comfort can vanish, that individuals might be called upon to function without institutional support, that life requires not just belief systems and material goods, but also the capacity to endure when both fail. Leon Crane learned this in 50 days. He was 24 years old when the B-24 crashed, 24 when trappers found him, but he emerged from Alaska's winter wilderness older than chronology could measure, carrying knowledge that youth should not possess but that crisis sometimes demands we acquire. The knife he carried from the wreckage was returned to him after his recovery. He kept it for the rest of his life, not as a trophy but as a reminder of fragility and resilience, of technology's limits and human adaptability, of the thin membrane separating modern civilization from ancient struggle, of the 50 days when survival depended entirely on his own resourcefulness, when no radio could summon help, when no supply line could deliver food, when no authority could provide guidance. When he was absolutely and utterly alone except for the wilderness that cared nothing for his rank or nationality or the righteous cause his nation claimed to serve. The knife was just steel and bone, a simple tool, but it represented the truth he learned in Alaska. When everything fails, when all systems collapse, when individuals confront nature's indifference, survival depends on the most basic capabilities, the oldest knowledge, the fundamental human capacity to adapt, endure, and persist against logic and probability, until either rescue arrives or death claims what it has always claimed. Waiting patient and inevitable at the end of all journeys through wilderness, whether measured in days or decades or the full span of mortal life.